Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. First, I'd like to recognize His Excellency, Mr. Flemming Møller Mortensen, the Minister for Development Cooperation and the Minister for Nordic Cooperation from Denmark. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Simonegre Nana, the Permanent Secretary. There you are, sir. Permanent Secretary for the Environment and Sustainability from Burkina Faso, and the Ambassador for Climate Change, Mr. Jan Wahlberg of Finland. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you all delegates, friends, and those joining us live on the live stream. My name is Ne'mel Barer. I'm a senior correspondent with CNN, and I will be your moderator today. It's actually a huge pleasure for me to be part of this event, because for so long, I'm from Sudan, and for so long, for women, indigenous, black and brown women from around the world, their needs, the reality of the impact that they suffer at disproportionate rates from climate change and from the inability to access effective reproductive health while attempting to sustain and uphold their families. In the face of that have been issues that have been siloed. So it's really fantastic to come together with the UN Population Fund, MSI Reproductive Choices, and the Margaret Pyke Trust. We have some amazing contributions lined up for you, from ministers to activists, ambassadors to leaders in emergency response. And our panel discussion, we are hoping, will set the tone by centering young women and women, Sherry, if you'll allow me, some of our younger activists, Zainab, and just to really remind ourselves of what it's like at the front lines of this work, and to hear directly from activists at the front lines of this work why it is so important for them to be platformed at international events like this. I mean, the statistics are pretty horrifying. Women and girls make up 80% of those affected by climate change, and yet regularly in the national and international mediation and negotiation on climate change boards, they make up something like 30%. So this is a wonderful opportunity to platform these voices. So first of all, what we're going to try and do, bearing in mind the difficulties around COVID and travel, and so many people who we would have loved to be here with us today at this and speaking at this event are not able to. So what we're going to be doing throughout this event is we're going to be bringing in short videos to allow some of these voices from the field to be part of our thinking here. So first of all, to set the scene for you, here is a short video from Senegal to explain why the issues we're discussing are so important for people from around the world.
léegi nag pour nga dem uti produit bi du bari doo am lu bari ak changement climatique ndax kenn ku nekk xam na ne changement climatique day tax taw bi dootul bari te taw bi bu amul lu ci bari fii environnement bi fii ñu bari ci géej gi la ñuy liggéey moo tax am na loo xam ne bu amee rek dina changer lu bari ci sunu dund ci population bi yombal sunu dund rek parce que tamit boo fekkee yombaloo sa dund nga xool heure bi nga jël grossesse yow da nga toog rek defuloo dara sa dund dafay jafe sa dund njaboot tamit dafay jafe.
La planification familiale, quand même, pour les femmes à qui je sers, a beaucoup impacté sur la vie de ces femmes. Parce que la contraception leur permet de vaquer à leurs occupations, notamment la pêche ou bien l'agriculture.
Planning suñ ko amee ñëpp nekk ci jàmm nga mun a toppatoo sa bopp toppatoo sa njaboot mun a liggéey sa liggéey moo tax ñuy toog rek di xool kañ lañ nga war a mun a jël grossesse bi waaw.
Thank you so much, MSI, for putting that video together for us. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Flemming Møller Mortensen, the Minister for Development Cooperation and Minister for Nordic Cooperation of Denmark. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was told. Do you hear me? Yes, that's good.
Yes.
I was told that there was a big risk when I should take off my mask that I would also take off my microphone. Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Our world is really facing a climate emergency. We know, all of us. And girls and women are some of the first to suffer from climate change. We also know, all of us. Climate change increases forced migration and exposes women to increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence. Extreme droughts force girls and women in developing countries to walk further from home to collect water. It leads to a long working day, less time for education, and put women and girls in greater risk of violence and abuse. We need to link implementation of adaptation action with human rights and equality to ensure a just and sustainable green transition. We have to. Denmark is leading by example. For instance, our Danish water sector interventions seek to advance gender equality and the rights of women and girls. Denmark's new strategy for development cooperation has a strong focus on gender equality and the rights of women and girls. Denmark works through important partnerships to ensure better access to education and sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's important that women and girls' access to family planning and SRHR services come from a right-based approach and with the aim to build resilience towards the effects of climate change. And not as a calculated means to reduce the carbon footprint of people who in the first place have not contributed to the climate crisis we are facing. As we saw, Burkina Faso, a nice country, Ouagadougou. I have recently visited Burkina Faso and seen how climate changes have caused shortage in water supply with the negative impact on women and girls. I was impressed by the passionate people who put so much effort into making a positive difference. The women behind the local cooperative who defy climate change and provide water for their agriculture. I saw with my own eyes how much women's access to education and sexual and reproductive health and rights matters, also in the relation to tackle the effects of climate changes. We need bold actions to tackle the climate crisis and its effects. This entails exploring new ways of creating synergies between climate action, sustainable development, and the rights for women and girls. By 2023, Denmark's grant-based climate finance is expected to reach more than $500 million with at least 60% dedicated to climate adaptation. It means a significant boost of engagement which focus on the nexus between women and girls' rights and climate change. And as we know, all of us, we are not going to leave anyone behind, and we cannot leave anyone behind. That's our goals for all of us. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Minister, and thank you for the commitment, but also for the reminder that climate change makes women and girls so much less safe around the world. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Simonegre Nana, the Permanent Secretary for the Environment and Sustainable Development for Burkina Faso.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler français. Et je prends la parole au nom de Monsieur le ministre de l'Environnement, de l'Économie verte et du Burkina Faso, qui hier encore était là et avait bien voulu être là, mais pour des raisons d'urgence, il était appelé au pays et est rentré hier. Donc, je livre ce message à son nom. Et Monsieur le ministre, distingués délégués, mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais tout d'abord vous transmettre les salutations de son Excellence, M. Roch-Marc Christian Kaboré, chef de l'État du Burkina Faso, qui suit avec beaucoup d'attention les présentes négociations sur le climat. Permettez-moi également de vous remercier pour l'honneur fait au Burkina Faso de partager son expérience sur cette question combien importante et préoccupante du genre dans les négociations climatiques. Mesdames et messieurs, en 2015, la communauté internationale a adopté 2 initiatives majeures. Les objectifs du développement durable à l'horizon 2030 et l'accord de Paris. Tous 2 intègrent l'égalité des sexes et les préoccupations des femmes. La prise en compte de ces préoccupations ainsi que le soutien aux personnes vulnérables est essentiel pour assurer un développement durable, objet de l'ODD 5, qui vise à parvenir à l'égalité des sexes et à l'autonomiser toutes les femmes et les filles. L'atteinte d'un tel objectif passe nécessairement par l'éducation, la formation pour une pleine jouissance des femmes de leurs droits en matière de santé sexuelle et reproductive. En Afrique, il est connu de tous que ce sont les femmes qui sont les pionniers de la sécurité alimentaire et financière de la cellule familiale. Aussi, le Burkina Faso a-t-il adopté en 2009 la politique nationale genre, dont la vision est de parvenir à une société burkinabé débarrassée de toutes les formes d'inégalité et d'inéquité de genre et qui assure à l'ensemble de ses citoyens et citoyennes les sécurités essentielles pour leur épanouissement social, culturel, politique et économique. Pour traduire cette vision, le ministère en charge de l'environnement de mon pays a procédé à l'intégration systématique de la question du genre dans les outils de planification de lutte contre les changements climatiques. On note notamment la prise en compte du nexus genre et climat dans les 2 contributions déterminantes nationales, dans la stratégie nationale sur les changements climatiques ainsi que le plan national d'adaptation. Les femmes ont également bénéficié d'un renforcement de leurs capacités dans le domaine de la négociation climatique. Ce renforcement de leurs capacités s'est étendu à leur association et a porté sur les contributions à la résilience climatique, la promotion des emplois verts, la transformation des produits forestiers non liés, la valorisation des sachets plastiques et la création de jardins nutritifs. Les plans sectoriels de contributions déterminantes nationales ont également intégré la dimension genre et le Burkina Faso a entamé de nos jours l'élaboration qui est très avancée d'un plan d'action national triennal genre et climat dans lequel 3 axes majeurs ont été dégagés. Ce sont le renforcement de la prise en compte de l'approche transformationnelle du genre dans les conceptions et la mise en œuvre des politiques et actions climatiques. 2. Le renforcement du cadre juridique et institutionnel en matière de genre et changement climatique. 3. La mobilisation des ressources financières en matière de genre et changement climatique. De nombreuses bonnes pratiques ont été mises au point et leur promotion fera accroître l'adaptation et la résilience des nombreuses femmes aux chocs climatiques récurrentes au Burkina Faso. Dans mon pays, les besoins non satisfaits en matière de planification familiale sont encore très élevés, 19,4%, soit une femme sur 5 n'ayant pas accès à la méthode contraceptive qu'elle souhaite pourtant adopter. Dans le domaine de l'accès des femmes à l'éducation, les disparités entre filles et garçons tendent également à s'éliminer depuis 2007-2008 en ce qui concerne la scolarisation. Mais les inégalités demeurent dans le secondaire, avec seulement 71% du taux de scolarisation chez les filles, contre 89% chez les garçons. Dans ce contexte, nous comptons dans le processus d'élaboration des outils de planification dans le domaine climatique, prendre en compte les problématiques d'accès et d'éducation pour les jeunes filles et le plein exercice des droits de santé sexuelle et reproductive des jeunes filles et des femmes au Burkina Faso. Aussi, je voudrais saisir l'occasion que m'offre la présente tribune pour demander l'appui financier de nos partenaires techniques et financiers pour la mise en œuvre du plan d'action national genre et climat du Burkina Faso. Pour terminer, je voudrais vous inviter à partager avec moi les justes propos de M. Malfada Duarte, responsable des fonds d'investissement climatique, qui, en marge de la COP24 sur le changement climatique, disait ceci. La voix des femmes est indispensable à la planification et à l'exécution des programmes du niveau local au niveau national. Nous devons veiller à ce que les femmes disposent des compétences, des outils et des moyens financiers qui leur sont nécessaires pour faire face aux défis du changement climatique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, sir, and especially thank you for stepping in at short notice when Minister Sawadogo had to return to Burkina Faso. Minister, I understand you will be leaving us, so we'd like to thank you and say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us. Now we'd like to bring you a message from Dr. Natalia Kanem, the Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, who are co-hosting this event today.
Climate change threatens the vision of human-centered sustainable development. It multiplies existing vulnerabilities that deepen inequalities for women and girls and limits their ability to realize their fundamental human rights. Climate crises disrupt access to essential, life-saving sexual and reproductive health services and medicines, including contraceptives. Rising air pollution and soaring temperatures worsen maternal health and birth outcomes. Girls may be pulled out of school and into marriage as extreme weather events make it harder for families to afford to feed their children. UNFPA is among the first on the ground when climate disasters strike. We know from experience that disasters and displacement can increase these risks and more. This includes an increased risk of violence against women and girls who often have to walk great distances unprotected to secure their water, their food, and fuel for the family. We also know that together, we have the solutions to address and prevent these impacts. With targeted climate adaptation financing, gender disaggregated data, strong health systems, and emergency planning that includes all ministries and sectors, we can support women and girls, their families, and communities. Together, we can deliver for everyone everywhere and ensure that the rights and choices of all are respected and upheld, even in a changing climate.
Thank you so much to Dr. Natalia Kanem for taking the time to record that. So now we are moving on to the panel discussion, which I'm super excited about. I'm going to be joined by Ms. Sherry Lim, the Lead Advisor for Gender, Resilience and Climate Change at CARE International, and Zainab Yunusa, youth activist and member of UNFPPC's Youth Constituency Youngo Women and Gender Working Group, Nigeria. If you guys like to join me up here. We were hoping to hear from Ms. Nasrina Saim, part of the climate change group from Sudan, but unfortunately she couldn't join us. But before we start the discussion, as we've said throughout the conversation and throughout this event, we're going to be hearing from experts to allow us to contextualize and understand and also kind of put down reference points for our conversation. So I am really excited to hear from Ms. Luisa Selma Setana Meke, President of the National Institute for Disaster Management and Reduction, the Republic of Mozambique.
Sua Excelência Ministro do Ambiente da República de Burkina Faso,
Sua Excelência Ministro do Ambiente da República da Dinamarca, caros participantes da COP26, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Permitam-me, antes de mais, saudar Sua Excelência Filipe Jacinto Nyusi, Presidente da República de Moçambique, pela forma pragmática como vem conduzindo o destino do país com vista a garantir a soberania dos moçambicanos. Inicio a minha intervenção destacando que Moçambique está entre os 10 países mais afetados pelos impactos das alterações climáticas que resultam na interrupção da produtividade em setores econômicos importantes e destruição de infraestruturas. Estima-se que o país perde, em média anual, cerca de 440 milhões de dólares com eventos hidrometeorológicos, cheias, inundações, induzidas por ciclones, tempestades tropicais e secas prolongadas. Dados recentes do ano 2019 indicaram uma queda de 12,6% do PIB, o que equivale a 4,9 mil milhões de dólares de perdas econômicas devido aos danos causados pelos ciclones Idai e Kenneth e que resultaram na morte de cerca de 700 pessoas e milhares de feridos e deixou mais de 1,7 milhões de pessoas necessitando de assistência humanitária de emergência. Estas experiências recentes demonstraram que o impacto sobre as mulheres é particularmente mais grave, primeiro porque constituem a maioria entre a população mais pobre e são mais dependentes de recursos naturais para a sua subsistência, que estão ameaçadas pelas mudanças climáticas. Por outro lado, a saúde da mulher fica exposta a mais perigos decorrentes da agravada escassez de serviços de proteção contra a violência baseada no gênero, de saúde sexual e reprodutiva, bem como a falta de condições adequadas para a higiene feminina e projetos de sustentabilidade que empoderam a mulher e garanta a sua soberania no contexto de desastres. A Estratégia Nacional de Adaptação e Mitigação das Mudanças Climáticas 2013 a 2025 reconhece o impacto desigual das mudanças climáticas e acrescenta que este é exacerbado por um conjunto de barreiras sociais, econômicas e políticas que limitam o desenvolvimento da resiliência das mulheres às mudanças climáticas. Portanto, é preciso incorporar uma perspectiva de género nas estratégias para responder às crises ambientais e humanitárias causadas pelas mudanças climáticas. São exemplo a necessidade de integração do pacote de serviços iniciais mínimos para a saúde sexual e reprodutiva e de violência sexual nos planos nacionais e regionais, de prontidão e resposta de emergência, que irão contribuir para aumentar a cobertura de serviços de saúde sexual e reprodutiva, da violência baseada no gênero e de projetos de resiliência que garanta a sua autossuficiência e soberania econômica. Precisamos de enfatizar a necessidade de novas abordagens para lidar com a saúde reprodutiva e a violência baseada no gênero, responder às mudanças climáticas e garantir o acesso equitativo à assistência. Devemos ainda trabalhar para acabar com as lacunas relacionadas à educação e à exclusão digital, de modo a garantir que não deixar ninguém para trás signifique não deixar ninguém offline. Para terminar, gostaria de referir que com a criação do Centro de Operações Humanitárias de Emergência e de Resiliência da SADC em Moçambique, esperamos que estas recomendações sejam incubadas para o benefício de todas as mulheres, não só no país, como também na região. Com estas palavras, o nosso muito obrigado.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us here. I want to start with Zainab. So, Zainab, you've heard all these incredibly powerful messages. Everybody seems to be saying the right thing. But from your perspective on the ground, What are the impacts you're seeing, and what is it, given that we all agree that these impacts are happening, what do you think decision makers just aren't getting?
Thank you very much for that question. So for me, these are mostly things that I've heard before. I've been hearing them and I've been seeing them. And I'm happy that they're at the forefront of the discussion, but it's also, let me just share some of what I have also witnessed, being someone that comes from Nigeria. So one of the major issues, one of the major impact of climate change in Nigeria is that of the impact it has had on insecurity, like the security and safety of human beings, actually, mostly in the northeastern part of Nigeria, where around the Lake Chad area, the border within there. So there's there's scarcity of resources. Here we're talking mainly about water. Because of human activities have also contributed to that. You have human beings competing for resources that is not able to go around, that's not sufficient for everyone. So we have this issue of the Boko Haram crisis. Obviously, many people here must have heard of it. So this has been going on since 2009, and it is leading to displacement of people. Now, among those that have been displaced, about 1.7 million of them are actually women and girls of reproductive age. You have a situation where these women and girls are now being internally displaced in their own communities. There are camps now set up in these regions for people that are not able to stay in where their original homes. They're now moved to camps. Now, when these women are in camps, it's not that they're in very comfortable conditions or it's not convenient for them. In fact, they're about 50% of most of the time, about 50% of the population of those that are being displaced they're women and girls. You now have a situation where their needs, their sexual reproductive health and needs, it won't stop. It can't stop. These are not just, it's not like a luxury, it's a need, it's a necessity. And in camps, these women are then exposed to higher risk of their health is not being considered. There are higher risk of gender-based violence. There are cases of maternal mortality. These women are getting pregnant when they don't want to, unintended pregnancies. It leads them to having to source to abortion. And these are definitely not safe abortion, unsafe abortion. So these are some of the risks. These are some of the impact that we can actually link to climate change. And there's sometimes when I'm having conversations with people working on the field directly, you hear things like, you know, the contraception, the one that we have for for men, is always readily available. So how come that of women? How come women have to they have to stress to get family planning, contraceptive, emergency contraceptive, even things as basic as menstrual pads? These are almost never available, and these women are wondering. It's a problem. It's a huge one to them, and some of these realities, some of these basic things are what I see. Then to talk about education too, so. Automatically for young girls, that's the end of education for them once they've moved from those places. And those that even manage to still continue to school. We have cases of kidnapping and abductions. I mean, you've been to Nigeria, you've seen what is happening with the story of the Chibok girls. And the Chibok girls is only one of the issues of kidnapping of girls that we've experienced in the Northeast. So you have all of this happening. Nigeria is already a country that has the highest number of out-of-school children. And of this over 10 million, 60% of them are young girls. So it's worsening the situation for young girls and women in that region. And to see that their needs, their fundamental human rights needs, such as sexual reproductive health, is not being prioritized, I think it's just making everything ridiculous.
Do you feel it? The fact that in the basic emergency assistance packages that this isn't just something that is automatic, does it feel to you as if they're the basic humanity of these women and girls, because they're refugees, because they're somehow reliant on external aid? Do you feel that in a way that dehumanizes them, that they're not seen in their totality?
It certainly does. It certainly does, because I think for me the priority of every government or anybody in a position of leadership is to serve their community and meet their needs, meet their basic needs. So, and sometimes, leading back to the second question of thinking, okay, why are policymakers, why are decision makers, why are they missing this? Isn't it supposed to be obvious? Because sometimes that's the question I ask. And then first of all, I look at those that are in this position to make these decisions. And I look around and I'm like, how many women or how many girls do we even have in this position? And there's this saying that you may not be able to relate in a situation or in a discussion where you do not experience. So sometimes I look around and all I see are their male leaders. Most of these are leaders are men. And sometimes they just cannot relate. They cannot understand some of these things. It is not an excuse. And then another reason that I've also seen or observed is that most of the time in the process of making these policies, even when they have the best intention, because they do not carry young people, young women along, they're not even consulted. You know, we come up with this huge text and policies, and the people in the community do not even have an idea of what is going on. They're not consulted. So most of the time, the entire point of it is missed. So they don't get the real desires, the real needs, the real problem and challenges are not included in most of these policies.
So I want to ask you then, Sherry, because you're slightly closer to the center, you're slightly closer to the policymakers and the decision makers. And given that you work in countries that are affected, tackling gender inequality in countries that are affected by climate change, how difficult is it for you to relay that message back to policymakers at events like this, on days like today?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Nima, for that question. I think, for us, it's really important that we just keep trying to re-emphasize and reinforce the messages that, to tackle a lot of these issues, we need to look at gender equality and actually looking at ensuring that our policies, our programming, climate action, is focused on women and women-centered, because, as you said, it really is, without having that focus, then it kind of gets lost, right? It gets lost in all the plans and the negotiations and talking about numbers and talking about action, but really actually looking at ensuring that we're identifying, the varying and different needs of women and that women have and women are facing, and the challenges that, they're facing due to climate change. For CARE, we work on sexual and reproductive health and rights, we work on girls' education, we work on climate change in many of the countries that are most affected by climate change. And so, looking at how, like in Zimbabwe and Somalia, for example, where, girls are pulled out of school because, their families they aren't earning any incomes anymore because of drought. Or like in Mozambique, we responded as well as CARE to Cyclone Ide and Cyclone Kenneth, and girls, can't continue their education because their families just, have lost their homes. We work with, CARE also worked with MSI on some programs in Madagascar and in Niger on, that link between sexual health and reproductive rights and climate change adaptation, and also seeing how because of gender inequality, women they don't have, as you said, they don't have access to SRH services, maternal health services. They don't have access to economic resources. They don't have ability even for decision making within their household. And so without tackling gender inequality, we can't actually support women to to build their resilience to climate change. And that's the message that we need to make sure that people are hearing here.
But this isn't women's rights, feminism. This is a matter of basic survival. I just want to pause our conversation there to bring in another voice with a message from Kristen Patterson, the director of Drawdown Lift at Project Drawdown.
Greetings, I'm Kristen Patterson, and I'm the Director of Drawdown Lift with Project Drawdown. I'm happy to be with you virtually to talk about the evidence for incorporating girls' education and family planning in climate adaptation strategies. Our mission is to help the world reach drawdown as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. Drawdown Lift works to address extreme poverty and climate change simultaneously by collaboratively identifying and promoting interdisciplinary solutions-based approaches that catalyze positive, equitable change in low and middle income countries. We are pleased to launch a policy brief that focuses on the evidence behind the need to include girls' education and family planning as critical components of climate adaptation strategies. Access to contraception and investments in girls' education are climate adaptation investments in people that provide myriad immediate and sustained benefits for girls, women, their families, and communities, contribute to achieving the SDGs, are cost-effective, and are long-term adaptation strategies. 3/4 of children who never enter primary school are girls. Rural, poor adolescent girls are especially at risk of not finishing school. Child survival is related to mothers' education levels. In fact, the benefits of education reverberate across one's lifespan. Household chores like fetching water and fuel, cooking, and sibling care impact girls' ability to remain in school. Climate shocks and stressors, which are becoming more frequent, increase such gendered responsibilities. The ability to plan and space births yields numerous benefits for mothers and children within and across generations, and contributes to improved participation in household decision-making and the labor force. Family planning has been shown to strengthen household and community resilience in Madagascar and Tanzania. Our new policy brief highlights 3 key recommendations. First, recognize that girls' education and family planning are long-term climate adaptation strategies in national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. Second, highlight girls' education and family planning in climate policies and forums. And finally, include girls' education and family planning in climate adaptation finance. Women and girls around the world are demanding that their rights to education and reproductive health be met. We don't need more evidence. Rather, we need parties at COP to take action based on the existing evidence we already have. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this vital topic. Please feel free to download the policy brief on our website and follow us on social media. Thank you.
So just to come back to you, Sherry, so as we saw Kristen say there, the evidence is pretty clear that you can't achieve your climate goals without an adaptation plan that speaks to the right and centers the rights of women and girls with regards to education and reproductive rights. So why aren't we seeing that? Why aren't we seeing that response, given that it is so clear-cut?
Yeah, I'd say that within the UNFPA processes, so these processes where governments have to produce adaptation plans and plans for reducing their climate emissions or their carbon emissions. It's not we're not integrating gender into that. Within these processes, there's separate gender work streams, and there's a gender action plan and national focal points for gender, which are very important, but they're quite separated.
So they're siloed.
It's quite siloed, yeah. And I mean, as CARE, it's interesting that Kristen has talked about that, because as CARE, we produced a report in December 2020 and July 2021, actually reviewing 56 of the national climate plans that countries have submitted, and found that gender is not cross-cutting across those plans at all, and it's not actually looking at gender across the different sectors of adaptation, mitigation, and capacity building. And when they mention women, they talk about women as vulnerable groups or as stakeholders, rather than actually looking at making sure that these plans and the action that's committed to is focusing on understanding the particular needs and opportunities for women as well. So until we start trying to bring it in, and rather than siloing it, it is going, we're not going to see the kind of change that we need.
So pretty much kind of a projection of the issues that women face across the sectors in Europe, in America, in the West, we're seeing be projected onto the ways that they're attacking the problems in the countries that they're providing aid to, essentially.
Very, very much so. It's, and as I said, it is positive that we have specific, gender action plans and focal points, and that, that it is prioritized. But until we actually see it integrated into the, the bigger commitments that are made, at COP and through the UNFPA processes, then, gender will still end up being sidelined often.
Zeynep, tell us something positive. Do you have any examples where you have been able to ensure that the donors and the donors' attention was put in the right place? And what impact did it have?
I mean, it's quite hard to say something positive, seeing as we're in the
Anything,
middle of a lot of chaos and problem. But I always like to commend the effort of, in as much as I criticize the government a lot, I always also try to of Nigeria. I also always try to commend the efforts of the government wherever it has been, wherever progress has been made. But I would say there's always room for a lot of improvement. For instance, just like what she said about gender being siloed. So in 2020, Nigeria government actually signed a gender action plan, sort of a national action plan on gender and climate change. So it was in a bid to say, okay, you know, we've heard the issue of gender. We're now trying to show you that it's important to us. We've recognized its importance. And it was a good thing. It was a commendable effort. But one thing that we always, youth group, women and young women and girls group, we always question is, how do we want to go about doing this? And do we have the resources into implementing these action plans? For instance, there was no specific mention of sexual reproductive health and right, but there was an aspect of it that mentioned health. And in that regard, it was focusing on training health workers, building their capacity to meet the specific needs of women in situations where climate change impacts have happened. It's good, but then do we have a budget to support this? Those are exactly. So those are some of the questions. Do we have the budget to support this? Do we have, when these trainings are being done, the workshops are held, do we have the resources? Do they have the product? Do they have the materials to actually then attend to these women and girls? So that's where we are. That's where we're still pushing for those specific implementation plan. And when...
Sorry, can I just ask quickly, were you consulted?
Pardon?
Were women
Yes,
activists consulted?
Actually, as a matter of fact, the action plan was actually, it was drafted in consultation with there's an NGO in Nigeria, Women Environmental Program. So it's also part of the Women and Gender constituency where I belong to. So it was done with that and with the government, and there was like a 3-day consultation. It was actually a good, smooth process that brought about that. But we need to back it up with the money to be able to implement it. And that's where a youth group, women's group, that's the pressure that we're trying to then push the government on saying, we have this beautiful plan, let's work together and to see how we can actualize it. And I think because we always also complain about the issue of finance, one positive thing that I would say, something that I would commend, and I don't know for other countries, but I think it's gradually gaining steps in Nigeria, is the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund is one of the largest finance agencies but that is trying to support developing countries in implementing their NDCs. So, and then one thing I like about that fund is that the aspect of gender is very crucial. In fact, if you have project proposals, if there is no aspect of gender-sensitive aspect of your project, it wouldn't even be accepted. So, but one issue with that is also in the process, the issue of being able to access those funds. Do we have the capacity to be able to come up with big projects, write them in a manner that it is acceptable to the standards of this? I mean, the project of getting the board to approve that. And there's an NGO in Nigeria that's working on training women, because it's a good opportunity for women-led organizations or group or young women to leverage and be able to access that finance. But you need to have the capacity. You need to have the knowledge. So one thing that they're doing is that's the Center for 21st Century Issues, which is also one that I volunteer for. So one thing they're doing, because access to information is also one thing, then being able to do something tangible with that information that you have. So they're able to train, gather young women, focusing especially on women-led organizations, train them on, what ideas do you have? Here is funding. This is how you can access this. This is how you can be able to write your project. Make them focus on this, and then we'll help you push it to getting the board to approve it. It's still it's a work in progress. I'll say we're not there yet, but it's something commendable. It's something that
But it's an example of women solving women's problems at a grassroots level that maybe some of these big money policymakers could learn from. I'm just going to pause once more because we're going to hear from David Johnson of the Margaret Pyke Trust.
Thank you. Almost a decade ago, the UN Environment Programme, in its 5th Global Environment Outlook, made UNEP's first of numerous calls for greater access to girls' education and family planning. As long ago as 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change noted in its 5th assessment report the value of family planning. And the most recent, relevant, related development comes from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, the union of governments and civil society that's the global authority on the status of the natural world and the measures needed to safeguard it. 6 weeks ago, IUCN launched their new Biodiversity and Family Planning Task Force, IUCN's first step to implement their resolution titled Importance for the Conservation of Nature of Removing Barriers to Voluntary and Rights-Based Family Planning. The resolution had been passed by a landslide of governmental and civil society votes from every continent. And of particular pride among those of us involved with this policy change was the unanimous support from every voting Indigenous peoples organisation. Today we're hearing positive developments from Nordic governments, and we need other donors and donor governments to follow their lead. Climate funding mechanisms should expressly encourage adaptation programmes with a direct focus on removing barriers to family planning and girls' education. It would be an easy change to make. It would reflect the views of IUCN members around the world and the IPCC. With just 0.5% of the targeted $100 billion annual sum to help developing countries respond to climate change, everyone who wants contraception could access it, including those on the front line of the climate crisis. It's time for governments to act.
David there makes a really important call for adaptation finance to incorporate the needs of women and girls with regards to education and family planning. Unfortunately, because this has been such a fascinating discussion, I've let time run away from us a teensy bit. So this is our last question, sadly. And so in addition to what you heard there from David, I'll ask both of you. Sherry, what outcomes would you want to see from COP in relation to girls' education, women and girls' needs and climate change? And then the same question to you, Zeynep, but Sherry first.
Yeah, well, definitely, I think it's very timely that this session is being done on Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day, because definitely would echo that we need to be seeing the governments committing to and actually achieving the 100 billion target and beyond. I think we've recognized now throughout the previous week that we need much more than that to deal with the issues that the most vulnerable countries are facing. Also commitments that needs to be at least 50% of that has to go towards adaptation, which is something that we've all been pushing for and are committed to, want to see happen. I think also, we need to be seeing stronger gender equality and, integrated and supported by climate action, by climate finance, and, particularly ensuring that, meeting our commitments that, whatever finance, whatever actions taken on climate change is actually, gender responsive and integrated throughout. And I'd say finally, I think we need to be looking at action that is that supports an integrated and holistic approach to supporting women and vulnerable people to be able to deal with the impacts of climate change. So that includes, sexual health and reproductive rights. It includes education. It also includes economic resources. It includes, support for disaster preparedness. So we need to ensure that we're supporting a whole package of interventions that will enable women to be able to make the choices and have access to the services and the support that they need to build, we need to build our resilience to climate change. So that's what we need. That's what we need to come out of COP this week.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Zeynep.
Yeah, I think mine will just build up on hers, just the same way that we're striving for 50% on adaptation and mitigation. But one thing I would like to see is in each of those aspects of tackling climate change, how about we say a certain percentage, 0.5, 10%, 1% of it goes specifically to women's and girls' needs, meeting their needs. So once we have that concrete, very specific instruction or direction or guide that all the countries have agreed to, then in the national governments or in the countries, we'll see how that would translate down to the national determined contributions, down to the action plans, down to the community level. And part of that will also be training the capacity of people. So it's not just that you have money being directed to women and girls' needs. You're making sure that you're training women and girls to be able to use that money so that they're not just the vulnerable group, they are now part of the solution. And another key thing for me is also, because all of this is easier when you have more maybe women or girls being able to influence from the decision-making level. So one thing for me, one thing that I would actually like to see, maybe it's a fantasy, maybe it's a dream, with COP, with all this negotiation and decisions that we are doing, how about we make it a sort of guide that we have, if we can't even get to equal number of representation first, we say, you know what, delegations are coming, we want to see at least 50% of women in your, as part of your negotiators, as part of your party team, as part of your, it just makes the conversation easier to table. When you have people that you know have your back, represent you, understand what you're going through on this decision-making table, it's easier to say, you know what, 10% of adaptation or mitigation funds go for women needs because they are the vulnerable group, but they also have to be part of the solution. So that's what I am hoping and looking forward to, and we'll continue striving towards.
Thank you so much. I think both of our panelists deserve a huge round of applause. Thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing a little of what you've learned from the ground. So finally, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jan Wahlberg, Ambassador for Climate Change from Finland, to deliver our closing remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you, El Bagir. It's a very tough job after this inspiring discussion. It's been a privilege to be here today and listen to all these remarks. I think the first point that I take home is how closely climate change and sexual and reproductive health and rights are interlinked. I think, Sherry, you mentioned a good example of girls being taken out of school when there is a drought. So I think we need to work more on this interlinkage. You said, Zanai, that you have heard all these discourses all the time. I think it's true. We know the basic narrative, but we need more discussion, and we need to get more into depth in this linkage, what it really means. And I think we also need to go and address the root causes behind gender equality, such as harmful gender stereotypes and social norms. The second point I would take, I think, is how gendered climate change actually is. And then kind of the learning for, at least for a Nordic climate ambassador, is that how closely this is related to human rights, social justice, and democracy. Again, I think, Zanai, you made good examples from Nigeria, how important this is, because I think as long as we don't take the sexual and reproductive health and rights into the core of human rights, and we cannot do the climate change in the right way, because then we are really missing. You said it's 80% of the people who suffer and only 30% in the boards. We need to change that. I think that's a clear message also, that this is a surprisingly gendered crisis, the climate crisis. Then I'm a Finnish climate ambassador, so just a few words on Finland. We have two cost-cutting priorities in our foreign policy. It is women and girls and climate change. And it's, for a climate ambassador, it's not always an easy equation. How do you mainstream this into the foreign policy and development policy? But I think this is something we need to do. We need to empower women and girls in their intersecting identities and youth and gender-focused organizations and take them into the climate process. So I think that's something I want to work as a climate ambassador. Friday I was participating in an event, I think it was the first time in COP history in Blue Zone, on climate change and disabilities inclusion. I think that's also something we need to work together. Gender, disabilities, human rights, they go hand in hand. I think my last point would be, and it's again, I'm looking at Zainab, you reminded us kind of that we need more dialogue. This is, it's been for me to be a government representative here and listen to civil society. I think it's a proof that we need far more discussion and understanding. You made very good points, both of you, on kind of what's needed out of COP, kind of get out of silos. And we are not integrating the gender into UNFCCC. I think you're right, Sherry, on that. And also that I think it's important that this event takes place on the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Day. We are launching 6:00 p.m. something we call the Champions Group. It's the 3 Nordics, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and then UK, Netherlands, and Ireland. And that's, in a way, the Champions Group idea is to respond to Secretary General's call of having balanced climate finance, 50-50 mitigation and adaptation. So I do think that this we need more and more work on adaptation finance and more and more resources. And at the core, I think we need women and girl and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I think time is running out. We are close to 1:30. This is kind of my impressions from this impressive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for being so willing to listen. Thank you for being so willing to take this back home with you to Finland. From my perspective, just sitting here as a woman, it really felt like the issues around women and climate change are the issues around women, which is that we are seen as things to be acted upon, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, rather than things that act. And who deserve to be part of a holistic solution. It is extraordinary because this is not what I cover as a journalist. So some of these figures were startling to me. How clear-cut the evidence is that you cannot respond in any way, not just effectively, but in any way to climate change without responding to the needs of women and girls. And hopefully, as both Zainab and Sherry made very clear, the time for talking should be over, that we should have proportional representation in COP. It is extraordinary that we do not have proportional representation in COP, and that once again, people are acting on behalf of women, speaking on behalf of women. So it feels like a very simple fix: start treating women like humans. And then from there, the climate change issue probably will be a lot smoother sailing. But as I said, I'm not the expert. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you for having me, the Margaret Pyke Trust, UNFPA, and MSI. It's been such a pleasure to be involved today. Thank you to the Ambassador, to the Vice Minister, to the Minister from Denmark who was able to join us. And thank you to all of you joining us from around the world.